Hello Propenomix people, and welcome to my video from Saturday the 22nd of June 2024. And this one is about housing, the key battleground in the upcoming election. I've written an article on property118.com about this subject, and this video is to try and bring that article to life a little bit. So you'll have noticed, unless you're hiding under a rock, that we're in the middle of a general election campaign, and we finally got round to one of the biggest issues that faces every single household one way or another. Even if you've got no mortgage, you're still thinking about what the next move might be, even if that's years in advance, let alone if you're a tenant struggling to find a new property because your landlord's had to sell up because of cost pressures and interest rates and all the rest of it. It really is relevant to everyone, and I'm surprised it's taken this long for us to get round to discussing housing in this election campaign. But really, it was kicked off by Michael Gove the other day, who, in case you don't know, isn't standing for re-election, has done a pretty passable job really as Housing Secretary, hasn't achieved all the things that he set out to try and achieve with things like leasehold reform, but then in fairness he got caught in the wash-up when the election was called months earlier than any Conservative MPs expected, apart from anything else. Didn't manage to get his renters reform bill through, so that would have been probably one of his biggest legacies. Incredibly unpopular when he was Education Secretary for the direction that he pushed the sector in, although there isn't huge evidence that the changes that he made had a terrible impact. More likely the terrible impact has been from the funding challenges that there have been over the years in education, even though a lot more money is being piled in. And now we've got a falling number of school places being required over coming years, we're told. But anyway, Gove, as the Housing Secretary, has overseen a whole number of different things, and he's really kicked off, even though he's not standing for Parliament again, he still kicked it off in this campaign, and that's what brought this article to the front of mind, apart from anything else. So look, we all know it's a hot topic. We all know it's going to be a big deal for the next election, and we've heard all of the political parties' plans now, and therefore what I'm aiming to do in this video is break those down, be as objective as possible, despite my obvious conflicts of interest in being an owner of a portfolio of rental properties. And I just want to try and take the good and the bad. You know, we know we're probably going to be dealing with a Labour administration, so we're going to kick off with them and let's see what they're saying and what they're thinking. There are a couple of other videos on the channel about the recent Labour Party sponsored report about the private rental sector, which had me absolutely apoplectic, mostly because the big suggestion in there that you wouldn't be able to ask a tenant to leave a property if you wanted to sell it. You would have to sell it with the tenant in situ, was something I found to be unpalatable apart from anything else, because that's not going to help our housing crisis. And the word, of course, that Labour has used here is transformational, and that's the word everyone wants to hear. I don't know if anybody really believes what anybody could achieve over a 5-year parliament could possibly be transformational anyway. You know, look at the scope of the problem that they're facing. Ultimately, we've got millions and millions of people, 8 million people in the PRS affected by rents rising and rising and rising. Not that owner-occupiers with mortgage are being hit any less hard. They're being hit even harder, realistically. But that's where they are, and at least I suppose they're in control of their own destiny to an extent, although of course mortgage arrears have been going up more and more. Now, of course, all the hostile policies towards landlords over the last 9 years have meant fewer and fewer affordable homes. There's another video on the channel about the recent report from Hamptons International suggesting 160,000 landlords are selling up, apart from anything else. Is a constant struggle of whether to get on the ladder or not. But this is the big political football problem at the moment. The reality is the price of shelter, the cost of living at the most base level, so we're talking shelter before even thinking food and energy and all the rest of it, has gone up much, much more than inflation in the real world. Energy has gone up massively and then come back down to kind of fit in now with inflation and wage rises and all the rest of it. But we're also going to see, probably with the incoming administration, council tax going up apart from anything else. But look, this is more than just spreadsheets and numbers and hyperbole, because this is ultimately, we're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. It is housing, it is shelter, it's people's homes, people's lives and people's futures, and ultimately how that affects society over the long run. So back to Labour anyway. Obviously more on the advocacy of the tenant side. Of course, I think they need to be a bit careful, because this could be quite misguided. They see the problem as a massive drop in the number of social housing units over the past years. So if you know anything about this area, you know right to buy kicked in 1980. Massive wealth transfer realistically to those who were in social housing, and the big damage in terms of the stock numbers and all the rest of it was done as soon as the policy came out. This was one of those where couldn't believe how popular it was too good to be true. The discounts were absolutely gigantic back in the day, and the big numbers were in 1980, 81, 82, 83. And of course, the one thing that was missing from Right to Buy is any mechanism to actually replace these homes in any meaningful way. And over the years, the scheme's been chipped. People were getting discounts that were too big. Discounts of 70%, were too big realistically. And it was probably just one of those things where if you were around at that time and you were lucky enough to have a social home, let alone if you were lucky enough for it to be in London, you can potentially have had huge benefits to those over the years. But what's annoyed people more than anything else about that wealth transfer is 40% of former right to buy units have ended up in the rental sector, in the PRS. So not directly successful, but it did mean wealth transfer from government to households. And poorer households. So it would have helped with social mobility. There's no two ways about it. So it's not an easy thing to solve. But the problem has been of recent years we've got up from building a few hundred social homes a year at one point in the early 2000s up to nearly 10,000 today. Pretty good. The schemes are a lot harder. They've been replaced by a whole variety of diluted schemes where discounts are much lower and all the rest of it. But there are still people out there with the right to buy under the old rules that haven't exercised that as yet. So you do still lose some every year. The sector's roughly breaking even with how many it's got, but you also get a lot of people in the social sector who want to be in the PRS. Why is that? Why do you think that is? Well, it's because the standards in the social sector are so very poor. But of course, the economics in the social sector are so very poor. Not enough rent is charged to operate these properties effectively, especially when you operate at the size and scale of a council or whatever. Whenever you do a job, if you are a one property landlord and you're handy, you may and you're qualified, you may well be able to go out and fix most of the problems that any of your tenants might have, and it doesn't cost you anything apart from your time. The bigger you get, the more that changes, and of course councils are realistically the biggest of them all. They're also not notoriously efficient in the way they deploy their resources, of course. But Labour see the answer as building 150,000 social homes annually. That's what they think they want to do. I feel two ways about this. We should really be aiming for a society where we don't need social housing, shouldn't we? But of course, we could argue that hasn't really worked over the last 45 years since Right to Buy kicked in. So maybe we need to just redress that balance first of all. It's more about aspirations, I suppose, that I have a slight ideological disagreement with that, but there we go. I could easily be wrong there. They don't want rent control per se, although Keir Starmer has fluffed a couple of questions about that recently. The PRS report that I've referred to in one of the other videos on the channel, it does mention rent stabilisation as a possible measure, which I don't think anyone reasonable is going to be against. And certainly Granger, the biggest in the game, already implement rent stabilisation, which means a rent rise every year, and it will be the lower of 5% average increase in wage or CPI inflation, the lower of the three. So not many people could say that's not fair, really, to be honest with you, apart from those who ideologically are opposed to rental property in the first place, of course. Now, Angela Rayner's still going around saying she's going to get rid of Section 21 on day one. We all know that's not how the law works. I'm surprised she's making these very broad brush statements. If she thinks she's going to change the unwritten constitution of the UK on day one in power, that'll be very disappointing apart from anything else, because it could cause a really big fuss. But I think what she means is the Renters Reform Bill is going to be straight up on the slate again, possibly picked up from where it already was. They may want to completely redraft and resubmit because it's not in line with their ideology enough and look too much like Conservative ideology. But we'll find out. I've been warning against this for a whole number of months. We would have been much better off to get, from a landlord perspective, get the RRB through the Commons and the Lords under a Tory administration. What comes back now could be really quite damaging. I just hope that Labour are careful, really, apart from anything else, because put off too many landlords at this stage, and all those people who are one property landlords who got a house they used to live in and they moved away or they moved abroad, or they kept it because they got with a partner and they decided to keep one of the houses and move into the other one. However they came about these properties, lots and lots of accidental ones, they'll all sell really well in the open market, realistically. And you might think, oh great, well that creates more owner-occupiers and that's all good. And, creating owner-occupiers is good, but ultimately taking away rental stock that's not being replaced in a market that already has got a massive deficiency in terms of how much rental stock there is, that's not going to be good. It's not going to be good for tenants. It'll be fine for owner-occupiers, not good for tenants. So if you want social mobility, and you'd expect the Labour Party to want social mobility, it doesn't really stack up. They say they're going to provide greater security and stability. I just don't think what they're saying will necessarily deliver. It's easy to say it's too ambitious and too costly. I think you've also got a problem in terms of just the level of resources that there are to be able to build these homes. Who's going to deliver these social homes? Will it be the private sector, funded by the public sector? If it's the public sector or local authorities, where's that money coming from? I think we're all waiting for a very probable rise in council tax for more expensive dwellings, apart from anything else. But I think it'd have to be a rise across the board, and quite a significant rise, in order to fund the development of social homes. And there'll be plenty of people who are just above the social housing threshold who are not that keen on paying more tax in order to subsidise social housing. Lots of newer developments that I've walked around in recent times that have got a social affordable element to them, the biggest winners on those sites, generally speaking, are the tenants who are going to get those very few, small number of social homes that are available, because they're then going to get baked in the right to buy. Now, they may not exercise that right to buy, or whatever it looks like, freedom to buy. There's all sorts of new words being thrown around, and there's that many changes in the right to buy system over the years. I haven't even been able to keep up with them, but most know that the big problem has always been not replacing. And that's been a problem across Conservative and Labour administrations. Labour had 13 years where they basically did nothing to address this problem, nothing at all. And I think probably that's part of what's making this incoming Labour administration want to address it, because they do realise that the Blair-Brown government was deficient in trying to solve any of these problems with social housing, and took a more of a, what would be a centre or a centre-right approach to, we should be having people who want to aspire. Tony Blair was keen on 75% of people going to university. That never made sense in any way, shape or form. But what was driving him was his ideology and his aspirations for people. Work hard, educate yourselves, get a house. Where Streeting gave an answer the other day, the incoming Labour Health Minister, which was basically saying that if his back was against the wall, he'd go and get a job. Normally an answer you'd expect from a right winger. So I dare say some of the left, the left of the left, would be quite upset with people like Mr. Streeting, who also wants to use the private sector to help deliver healthcare and lower the waiting lists, apart from anything else. So Labour, can they deliver it? Is it too costly? Have we got the resources, the skills in the country? The answer to that is no, we haven't. But let's see what they can do. I know they're probably going to liberalise planning, apart from anything else, and I think that will be very popular amongst developers and lots of people, apart from those who don't want building in their own backyard. I very much support it, and I think Greenbelt needs constant reassessment. Grey Belt needs usage. There's some good stuff in there. So let's see what happens. I'm not going to personally benefit from any of that. I'm not an out-the-ground developer, nor am I going to become one just because the planning laws get liberalised. I don't enjoy that part of the job, or the sector, so it's not going to feather my own nest anyway. But there we go. So still theoretically in second place, the Conservatives would have to talk about next. They're obviously focusing on home ownership rather than anything else. They would like to extend right to buy to housing association tenants. How would that work? I would assume that the housing association would continue to be incentivised by the government purse making up the gap between the discounted price for the HA tenant and or offering more generous grants for replacing sold properties with new build properties from the HA. It makes sense to boost more home construction. They're also talking about simplifying the planning process. I really struggle to believe that when they just haven't done anything on that front for 14 years, apart from permitted development, which has been somewhat successful, but really it's quite niche and has only led to perhaps a delivery of maybe 25,000 extra units in a year. Not to be sniffed at. Pretty good work on the PD front. They've gone pretty far with all of that. Probably a little bit too late, really. That should really have kicked off 20 years ago, but there we go. They want accessible home ownership, but they're not really proposing anything for affordable rentals. I'm not sure what counts as affordable these days, because affordable technically up to 80% of market rent. Problem is rents are up 25% apart from anything else. So if inflation has hit you particularly hard for whatever reason, what's now affordable was the old market rent about 4 years ago, and the pace at which things are moving upwards. If the market rent's moving up at 6, 7, 8% a year, as the ONS suggests, more like 8% plus a year, then the affordable is still moving up by 80% of that, 6.4% a year. That's not really that affordable apart from anything else, but there we go. Then I'm going to do the other parties apart from Reform first, because they're not that interesting on this front, really. It's all about sustainable housing projects, the Lib Dems and the Greens. All they want to do is raise tons more tax and think throwing money at every problem is the way that they're going to do everything, whereas really it'll just probably foster a load of inefficiencies apart from anything else. But they're emphasising environmentally. Of course, that's what you'd expect, particularly from the Greens. Sustainable developments. There's already been quite a lot of moves made in that department in terms of where EPCs need to be at and electric vehicle charging and all the rest of it. We do need well-insulated homes. We don't need them built on floodplains. That's one of the chief problems that we have, apart from anything else. You can sustain as much as you want, but if the future means more rain, then ground that you haven't built on historically, because rain has been a bit of a problem, it's a massive problem unless you put in some pretty significant drainage improvements in those schemes. And we've all seen lots of pictures of schemes that are underwater, quite literally rather than financially. They want more support for local communities in housing decisions. I don't know about that, because it seems to me that local communities tend to get in the way of housing development, so I'm not sure how they think that would help. They just talk about comprehensive collaborative solutions. I think you probably need people from outside of areas to make decisions on planning in order to make it happen, rather than the other way around. It's just a bit of a social dream that people would collaborate and say, oh yes, we want this wonderful development. I live in Solihull in the West Midlands, and there's a great plan for transforming the square in Solihull that desperately needs investment. It's got an old Marks and Spencer's that's now been empty for years. It's got an old House of Fraser that's a very difficult building to convert. It needs a massive redevelopment. It's got a load of grotty flats above the shops that do still exist in the square that still works. And ultimately, instead, what's happened, generally speaking, the local Facebook groups and all the rest of it are completely against the development. There's nothing you could do and put in there that would make people enthusiastic about any kind of property development. They're just against it by their very nature. They don't even look at it. They don't think about the benefits to the economics of the area. They don't care about it, and you're not going to get collaborative groups. Solihull's flitted between Conservative and Lib Dem over the years. It is a particularly liberal part of the world, and they don't get it, and they don't want development. So I don't know where in the country would, but there you go. So I need to reserve the last bit of the video really for reform, because overall I'm not a big fan of Nigel Farage, don't get me wrong, but I do think he's the sort of difficult individual you want to have poking around, asking questions, causing trouble. You need that in a government so people can't get away with, apart from anything else, handing PPE contracts to their mates and things like that. He performs the same role as a George Galloway, and if you've got 650 MPs, I think you can afford to have 6 or 7 really bloody difficult ones who you might completely disagree with nearly everything they say, but they're good in terms of what they bring up. They're good in terms of the spotlight they shine on the system, the scrutiny that they bring along, and that's the sort of purpose that they serve for me, a disruptor apart from anything else. But reform are easily the most attractive to the landlords. They're saying things like they're going to scrap Section 24. You've still got 94% of rental properties owned in personal names in the UK. 94, quite incredible. 2018 it was 97, so that's the slow pace. So in 6 years' time, that's the sort of progress that has been made. Quite incredible. But scrapping Section 24 will be very popular indeed, apart from anything else. They want to roll back the hostile environment. They want to welcome private sector landlords. Landlords are going to... The Conservatives have left this massive space over to the right of where they've moved to over the years in terms of landlording policy, and it's just been dead easy for Reform to reverse the rig into that and hoover up a lot of these votes. If something like 1 in every 6 people is a landlord in the UK, I think it's slightly less than that, but might be 1 in 6 of the voting public. Apart from that, some of the older people are, the more likely they are to own property assets. But that gives Reform a lot of votes by default, potentially. Although I'm not necessarily suggesting that I'm going to vote for Reform, but that's a different kettle of fish. They're economically extremely naive, and that's got to be picked up upon. What they've said in terms of they've got this massive long list of giveaways that looks superb, and then they make these broad brush statements like, well, just grow the economy an extra 1% a year. I mean, it seems unlikely that people who don't know anything about economics are going to be able to come in and do that just by having a few policies. And they're assuming they're getting this money, and they're assuming an extra 25 billion a year, an extra 10 billion in tax take just from growing the economy more efficiently. They're assuming they can save 40 billion a year on paying interest to the commercial banks, even though the entire interest bill out, before we net it off, the entire interest bill out is 37.5 billion as it stands. And I've written quite a lot about that for tomorrow's Sunday supplement, so I won't spoil all of that, but there's no such number anywhere near 30, 35, 40 billion on the table for doing that. So the big fear would be what they would do to the bond markets. It would make Liz Truss look like she knew what she was doing, and Kwasi Kwarteng looked like an excellent Chancellor of the Exchequer, in my opinion. So that I do find problematic. But there we go. They've got an awful lot of traction at the moment. So I think they'll score and do surprisingly well. Although people will only be voting for Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. They won't be voting for the other candidates, because the other candidates are a shower, realistically, when it doesn't take long to look into them. It's not great. It's not great in terms of who else they've got standing. They've got a few credible people, and I think Richard Tice knows what he's talking about from a libertarian business perspective. I don't think any of that would help social mobility, apart from anything else, but there we go. But anyway, onto the electoral implications then. All the voters, you'll all have made your own minds up and looked into some of this stuff, I'm sure, if you're voting on the 4th of July. Are they feasible? And will that really be a key factor in people's decisions, or will they just vote for what they like? Or do they just think these days they're all telling lies? None of them are going to be able to hit a target of 320,000 homes a year, 340,000 homes a year. It's not going to be possible. There's no way the infrastructure's there. There's no way the appetite is there. There's no way the planning system is there. There's no way the laws are there. There's no way the funding is there at the moment. So there's absolutely no chance of that happening. And I think maybe everybody just gets disillusioned in that case. But do you then just vote for the least worst? Vote for the one you like the sound of and hope they might get some of these things done? Cross your fingers? I don't really know. Do we think that the party that really convincingly addresses affordability of housing is going to gain significant traction? I don't know. They just don't really feel all that believable to me, apart from anything else. So everyone's got their own take. Everyone's got different solutions. These things are going to continue to evolve over the next couple of weeks. I'd really be interested to hear in the comments as to who you think has got the best plan to tackle the housing crisis. And please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any more insights on the upcoming election and on the property and economic situation going forward. The channel will be continuing long after the election until the puzzle is solved, which of course it never will be, apart from anything else. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.